The night shift at the interstellar signal array often felt slow and empty, but the quiet did not bother Lena, because she liked to listen to the soft hum of the machines while she sat alone in the dim control room. She watched rows of screens, show steady waves of static as the giant dish outside turned across the sky. Most nights were the same, and she expected this night to be just like all the others. Then something changed when a thin spike of sound broke the pattern. It was sharp, sudden, and nothing like the usual random noise. She leaned forward and increased the volume. At first she heard only crackles and static, but she felt her pulse rise because she knew that this was not a natural sound. She checked the coordinates and saw that the signal came from a place far outside any known route. She tried to clear the audio, and then a voice pushed through the noise. It was faint, but she could tell it was a voice. It was shaky and full of fear. She listened harder, and the voice became clear enough to understand. It said a simple message that changed everything. It said, "Please help us." Then there was a pause filled with static, and the next words came. It said, "The harvesters are here." Then the signal cut off for a moment before returning in broken fragments that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She replayed the message several times to be sure she heard it right. She had never heard of harvesters, but the voice carried the weight of real terror. She saved the recording and alerted her supervisor, who arrived half asleep and annoyed. He listened with a frown and rubbed his eyes. He told her it was probably a prank or a natural echo that sounded like speech, because space interference could trick human ears. He said she should not jump to conclusions because strange signals came all the time, and most meant nothing. Lena wanted to argue because she knew this was different, but he ordered her to mark it for review and move on with routine work, he said. The morning team would handle it, and he left the room. Lena sat alone again with the message still whispering in her mind. She could not shake the feeling that someone very far away was begging for help, and no one on Earth cared enough to listen. By sunrise, the signal had spread across private channels because she had sent a copy to a friend in the research division who then shared it with someone else who shared it again. Soon the message reached people who sat in shadowed corners of the world. Some were former soldiers cast aside after wars ended. Some were enhanced humans with genetic upgrades that made ordinary people afraid. Some lived off the grid because governments said they were too dangerous. Some were convicts who walked free but carried heavy labels that could never be washed off. These were the people the world called monsters because they looked strange or fought too hard or had pasts that scared society. They did not belong anywhere, but they understood fear and pain better than most. One of them was Rafe Calder, a tall man with old battle scars and implanted muscles that worked like steel cords under his skin. He had been a hero once, but was later blamed for a mission that failed because of orders from above. He lived alone now in a metal shed near the old desert ranges. He received the signal on an encrypted channel he kept only for emergency scans. He listened to the voice and felt something twist in his chest. The fear in the voice reminded him of soldiers he had once failed. He could not forget them, and he could not ignore this new cry for help. Another person who heard the signal was Mira Kent, a young woman with a rare technopath implant that let her speak to machines through her nervous system. She lived in a small room in an old tower block because she was banned from working with any official networks. She heard the call through a broken receiver she had patched together from spare parts. The voice shook her because it sounded desperate and real. She closed her eyes and felt a surge in her implant because she knew she could trace the signal better than any legal lab. She whispered that someone out there needed help, and she whispered that she would not let them down. Across the sea, a man, known only as Jex, sat in a dark warehouse filled with stolen parts of aircraft and old starship components. He was a pilot who once flew top-speed fighters until he was caught selling flight data to survive. He now flew illegal transports for anyone who could pay. He listened to the message while fixing a fuel line, and he felt something shift inside him because he knew the voice was not faking fear. He had heard many lies in his life, and this was not one of them. In the northern zones, two brothers named Thorn and Hale, both strong and broad from years in the harsh labor colonies, heard the message through a smuggled cum unit. They were former convicts who had been set free after years of fighting just to stay alive. People avoided them because they looked dangerous and because their hands had done terrible things in the past.
Ow!
But when they heard the voice begging for help, they understood it better than anyone. They had begged before, and no one had come for them. A signal like this should have gone through official lines, but Earth governments met behind closed doors and argued for hours. They wondered if the call was bait from an enemy who wanted to draw Earth forces into a trap. They said the distance was too great and the target world too far outside mapped space. They said they had no duty to risk fleets for strangers who might not even exist. The message was added to a list of unsolved signals and pushed aside while they planned other projects. But the people Earth called monsters did not wait for permission. Rafe contacted Myra using an old code from military channels. He asked if she could trace the source, and she said yes, because she had already done it. She gave him coordinates and said the call came from a star system with no known human colonies. Rafe then contacted Jex because he knew Jex owned a ship fast enough to cross the distance. Jex agreed after a long silence. He said he was not a hero, but he could not ignore someone begging for help. Thorn and Hale heard whispers about a crew gathering to answer the signal, and they decided to join, because they owed the universe nothing. But they also knew they could not sit still while someone cried out for help. One by one, they met in an abandoned hangar outside a forgotten city. Rafe stood at the front and told them he did not know if they would survive the journey. The star system was too far, and the threat was unknown. But he said he was going because he could not stand by while voices begged for help and died alone in the dark. Mira said that the message carried a kind of fear that could only come from real danger. She said someone was hurting, and she would not let that continue. Jex said he had a ship called Wraith 7 that could reach the system using a jump core taken from a secret project. It was illegal, but it worked. He warned them that the jump could tear the ship apart, but they all agreed to go. Thorn and Hale said they had nothing left on Earth, and they preferred to die fighting for someone else rather than die in silence. They loaded supplies and checked weapons. They worked together even though none trusted the others. They were broken. People who had been pushed to the edges of society. They did not know if they would make it back. They did not even know what they would face when they arrived. But they knew that they were the only ones who had answered the call. As the Wraith 7 powered up, the hangar shook with the sound of engines. The crew stood ready while lights blinked across the cockpit. Mira connected her implant to the navigation system and guided the ship toward the coordinates. Rafe took the front seat with heavy calm. Jex placed his hands on the controls and breathed slowly. The brothers strapped in near the storage bay. Outside the hangar, the city slept without knowing that a group of outcasts was about to launch into unknown space to answer a call everyone else had ignored. The engines roared as the ship lifted off the ground. The jump core pulsed, and the air shimmered. The crew looked ahead with steady eyes because they had made their choice. They would go to the place where the voice came from. They would face whatever waited there. They would answer the cry for help. The Wraith 7 jumped into the dark and left Earth far behind. The Wraith 7 moved through space with a quiet power that seemed impossible for such an old ship. The engines hummed steadily, and the jump core glowed softly as it stabilized the trajectory toward the distant system. Inside the ship, the crew adjusted to the rhythm of travel, each lost in their own thoughts while the stars stretched endlessly. Outside the windows, Rafe sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the blinking lights and listening to the steady hum of the ship. His hands rested lightly on the controls, not because he needed to touch them constantly, but because it made him feel in control. Mira leaned against the navigation console, her eyes half closed as she connected to the ship through her implant. She could feel the ship's every movement, every pulse of energy, and it calmed her in a strange way. Jex checked the engine outputs, again muttering numbers under his breath while adjusting valves and stabilizers. Thorn and Hale were in the cargo area, securing supplies and quietly sharing stories of their past lives. They spoke softly because they did not want to disturb the others, but their words carried a kind of trust that was new to all of them. No one had expected this to feel like a crew. The journey was long. Days passed without sight of any other ships or planets. The stars moved slowly as the Wraith 7 crossed the void. The crew ate little, rested little, and spoke only when necessary. The silence was not empty, however. Each of them thought about the voice they had heard, the desperation in it, and the lives depending on them. Mira traced the signal again, making small adjustments to the course that reduced the travel time slightly. She whispered the coordinates to Rafe, and he nodded, trusting her instincts because he had learned long ago that sometimes machines spoke the truth better than humans. Jex, meanwhile, maintained the engines, checking fuel lines and cooling systems. He did not talk much. He had flown many dangerous missions before, and had seen too many die to waste energy on unnecessary chatter. Thorn and Hale joked occasionally to lighten the tension, their voices rough but warm. The others allowed themselves small smiles because it reminded them that they were still alive. On the 5th day of travel, a warning light blinked on the console. Mira's implant detected something unusual in the energy readings. She leaned forward and traced the anomaly, her fingers flying over the touchpad. The sensors showed a dense cluster of objects moving in the path ahead. But they were not natural, she said. They were machines. The crew froze for a moment. Machines in the middle of empty space were always dangerous. Jex immediately altered the course slightly to avoid direct contact. But the sensors showed that the objects were following them. Rafe gritted his teeth and kept the ship steady. He said the Wraith 7 was fast but not invincible. These machines wanted to attack. They could do so at any moment. Myra's hands glowed as she tapped deeper into the ship's systems. She felt their intent as clearly as if they were in the room with her. They were hunting, she said. She did not know why yet, but they were moving with a single mind and a single purpose. Jex read the energy signatures and nodded grimly. Thorn and Hale readied weapons in the cargo bay, while Rafe adjusted shields and prepared evasive maneuvers. The Wraith 7 moved faster, twisting around the invisible currents of gravity as Mira guided it through small, safe paths. Like this tension hanging in the air like thick smoke. Each member of the crew knew that if one mistake was made, they could all be destroyed. Finally, the cluster of machines lost track of them. Myra suggested a sudden jump to escape completely, and Rafe agreed. The jump core flared, and the ship vanished from the sensor range of the machines. The crew let out long, shaky breaths as the tension left their bodies. They had survived the first real test, but the incident left them uneasy. The machines were not normal. Mira said she had never felt anything like them before, not even during simulations or old military warnings. Rafe asked if they were like the harvesters, the ones mentioned in the signal. Mira paused and nodded slowly. She said she could not be certain, but the energy patterns were very similar. They moved with intelligence, and they hunted like predators. Jex slammed a fist on the control panel. He said they were lucky to escape and reminded everyone that the journey ahead was even more dangerous. Thorn and Hale looked at each other and nodded. They did not speak much, but both understood the stakes. If they were going to help the ones calling for aid, they had to stay ready for anything. Days passed again, in the long silence. The crew took shifts to sleep, monitor systems, and track the signal. Mira refined the coordinates constantly, making small jumps and adjustments that kept them on course. She discovered that the signal had a faint repeating pattern hidden inside it. It was like a heartbeat. Someone or something was alive, sending a continuous call for help. Rafe said that gave them hope. The voice was still there. It meant survivors remained in the system. Jex said they had to be careful, because hope could also lead them into a trap. Thorn and Hale made jokes about surviving everything life had thrown at them, only to meet a trap in space. No one laughed, but the humor lightened the fear just a little. Finally, the Wraith 7 approached the outer edge of the star system. Myra's implant detected debris floating in orbit. She told the crew that this could be old satellites or wreckage from a previous civilization, but the patterns looked strange. They were arranged in ways that suggested intelligence. Rafe slowed the ship and brought it into orbit for a careful scan. The readings showed massive structures on the planets below. One world appeared scorched, with black scars across its surface and jagged towers rising from the ground. Another had strange energy flares that pulsed like the signal they had traced. Mira said the readings matched no natural formations she had ever studied. Jex said it looked like someone or something had been building machines here for a long Thorn and Hale looked out the observation windows and shivered. Even from orbit, the scale of destruction was frightening. The voice they had followed could be somewhere down there, trapped among ruins. Rafe decided they should enter orbit around the scorched planet first. Mira said she would continue tracing the signal to narrow down the exact location of survivors. Jex prepared the landing systems and checked the ship's shields. Thorn and Hale readied weapons in case something tried to attack them on arrival. As the Wraith 7 lowered into the upper atmosphere, the crew saw more clearly the scale of destruction. Cities were reduced to rubble, smoke and fire rising from the remains. The towers that Mira had detected were massive machines, standing, motionless but appearing dangerous in the weak light of the sun. The voice they had followed was getting stronger. Mira said it was coming from a deep network beneath the planet's surface. Someone or something had hidden from the machines above. Rafe nodded and said they would have to land carefully. They could not risk an open confrontation yet. They needed the element of surprise, and most importantly, they needed the people. Alive when they reached them, the crew made the landing on a flat plateau near the surface ruins. The ship shook slightly as it touched down, but the landing was steady. Thorn and Hale were the first to exit, scanning the surroundings with their weapons. The air smelled scorched, heavy with ash and dust. Jex and Rafe followed closely behind, carrying tools and gear. Mira connected her implant to portable devices, tracing the signal to find a safe path to the source. The voice was stronger now, clearer and filled with terror. They moved carefully, stepping over rubble and broken metal, avoiding the towers that rose like silent guards. Hours passed as they followed the signal. Mira guided them through underground tunnels that were partially collapsed. The walls were hot to the touch, and the sound of distant machines hummed through the stone. They finally reached a wide cavern where small groups of survivors were hiding. The people were frightened, weak, and dirty from weeks without food. They looked at the crew with wide eyes, unsure if they were friend or enemy. Rafe knelt and said, softly, that they were there to help. Myra showed that the machines outside were still watching, but had not detected them yet. Jex began setting up a temporary shelter and supplies, while Thorn and Hale kept guard at the entrance. The survivors slowly approached, recognizing that the crew meant no harm. One of the survivors, a man with a burned arm and tear-streaked face, explained that the harvesters had destroyed their colonies and hunted anyone who tried to escape. He said the tunnels had been their only protection. The voice on the signal was from his daughter, who had been separated from the group during the first attack. She had been trapped in a lower chamber of the mines, unable to move and barely able to speak. Rafe promised they would find her. Mira quickly traced the remaining signal to its source, led them deeper underground to a narrow passage barely large enough to enter. The crew prepared themselves for the unknown, knowing the machines above could still be aware of movement below. They tightened straps, checked weapons, and moved forward with careful steps. The signal grew stronger, more desperate. Finally, after crawling through narrow tunnels and stepping over broken rock, they found her. A small girl, no older than 10, was huddled in a dark corner, terrified but alive. She looked up with wide eyes, and when she recognized that the crew were there to help, she reached out without fear for the first time in weeks. Mira carried her back to the main cavern, and the survivors cried quietly, grateful that someone had come. The crew had succeeded in the first part of their mission. They had found the survivors and ensured that the voice that had called to them had been answered. But as they looked at the scorched planet, the broken towers, and the distant machines standing silently above, they knew this was only the beginning. The harvesters were still out there, and the journey to save everyone would not be easy. Each member of the crew understood that they had been called for a reason. They would have to face dangers beyond anything they had imagined. Yet, for the first time, they felt a bond not just with each other, but with the people they had saved. And that bond would give them strength for what was coming next. The crew of the Wraith 7 spent the first night in the cavern quietly. The survivors were exhausted, some crying softly, others just sitting in stunned silence. The small girl clung to Mira, and Mira held her gently, whispering that she was safe now. Rafe walked to the edge of the cavern and looked up through the cracks in the ceiling. Could see faint glimmers of light from above, the towers of the harvesters still. Standing tall, like dark sentinels watching every movement, he felt a chill, not from the cold, but from knowing how powerful these machines were, and how little the people below could do against them. Jex worked on reinforcing the cavern entrance with salvaged metal and debris to make a temporary barricade. Thorn and Hale patrolled carefully, listening for any sound that might indicate the machines had noticed them. Mira kept her implant connected to small devices that traced the harvester energy signatures above. She said they were still scanning, still waiting, and that time was not on their side. The survivors explained more about the attacks. They had no weapons, no defenses, and the machines seemed unstoppable. They had tried to fight back at first, using old equipment and tools, but the harvesters adapted too quickly. Each time they thought they had a chance, the machines learned and destroyed more of their homes. The survivors had fled underground, hoping to hide, but even that was dangerous. Some of them had died of hunger, some of fear, and some simply gave up. Rafe listened quietly, his jaw tight, and then spoke. He told them they had a chance now, that the crew of the Wraith 7 had come to help, and that they would not be left to die. The survivors looked at him with hope in their eyes, something they had not felt in weeks. The crew needed a plan. They could not stay in the cavern forever. The harvesters would eventually find them, and even the tunnels were not completely safe. Myra said the signal of the girl's voice could be used to locate the remaining survivors in other areas. Traced the patterns and marked safe paths through the tunnels. Rafe suggested splitting into small teams, some to rescue more survivors and others to set traps or sabotage the harvester structures above if possible. Jex frowned and said that going above ground was extremely dangerous. The towers were not just structures. They were active machines, watching and responding to any movement. Thorn and Hale said they could handle it, that they had fought worse on Earth and survived. The decision was made. They would move carefully, using the tunnels to their advantage, and try to rescue as many people as possible. The next day, they began the mission. Mira led one small group deeper into the tunnels, following the signal to another chamber where a cluster of survivors had been hiding. The path was narrow and uneven, filled with fallen rocks and unstable walls. They had to move slowly to avoid alerting any machines above. The group whispered to each other, communicating in simple signals and hand gestures. When they reached the chamber, they found more frightened people, including children and elders. The survivors were shocked to see them, but relief quickly replaced fear. Mira used her implant to guide them along hidden paths that avoided detection. The small group moved like shadows, carefully, quickly, and silently. They rescued the survivors and brought them back to the main cavern one by one. Each success gave them strength. The bond between the crew and the survivors grew stronger. Meanwhile, Rafe and Jex examined the harvester towers above. They studied the patterns, the movements, and the energy readings. They realized the machines were connected, a network that shared information instantly. If one was attacked, the others would react immediately. Jex said they needed a distraction, something to draw the machine's attention away from the tunnels. Rafe agreed and suggested using portable EMP devices they had scavenged from the ship. The plan was dangerous because it could trigger a full-scale attack, but it was necessary. Thorn and Hale prepared the devices and set them in key locations on the surface, timing each carefully to create confusion without drawing the full force of the harvesters. As the crew worked, the tension grew. Every small sound echoed through the tunnels and across the scorched surface above. Myra constantly monitored energy flows, warning the others of any sudden changes. The small girl stayed close to her, whispering questions about the machines, the stars, and why no one else had come to help. Mira answered as best she could, keeping her voice calm and steady. The survivors looked to the crew for guidance, for protection, and the crew felt a deep responsibility to keep them safe. The first EMP devices went off with quiet flashes, disrupting the nearby harvester towers. The machines reacted immediately, sending out energy pulses to detect the source. Rafe and Jex watched from a safe distance as the signals fluctuated and the tower's lights flickered. The machines moved to investigate, leaving gaps in their monitoring of the tunnels. Myra led the survivors through these gaps, moving swiftly but carefully. Thorn and Hale stayed behind to set additional devices and cover the exit paths. When the last group reached the cavern, Jex triggered the final EMP, creating enough confusion for everyone to move safely back to the Wraith 7. The crew paused to rest once they were all together. The survivors were exhausted but alive. The small girl clung to Mira and whispered, "Thank you," softly, her eyes filled with tears. Rafe looked around at the people they had saved and felt a mix of pride and fear. They had succeeded, but the system was not safe yet. The harvesters were still active, still searching, and the crew knew the battle was far from over. Jex repaired and checked the ship's engines while Myra monitored the energy patterns. Thorn and Hale patrolled the perimeter, keeping watch for any movement above or below ground. Each member of the crew understood that they had to stay alert, that one mistake could be fatal. That night, they held a meeting in the cavern. Rafe spoke quietly but firmly. He told everyone that their mission was not just about survival, but about hope. They had shown the survivors that someone cared, that someone would fight for them, and that gave them strength. Mira explained that the machines were not mindless. They were learning and adapting. Any further rescue attempts would require careful planning, precise timing, and coordination. Jex reminded everyone that the Wraith 7 was their lifeline, that the ship's speed and technology gave them an advantage they could not ignore. Thorn and Hale said that fear was natural, but courage was a choice, and they had all chosen to act despite the danger. The survivors listened and nodded, some in disbelief that humans like the crew would risk so much for strangers. The following day, they began preparing for the next mission. Mira continued tracing the remaining signal, which now included faint new cries for help. Rafe and Jex modified equipment, reinforced the ship, and prepared supplies. Thorn and Hale trained the survivors in basic safety and self-defense, giving them simple tools and instructions to follow if danger approached. The small girl stayed close to Mira, learning quickly to move quietly and listen carefully. The cavern had become a base, a place where the crew could plan, rest, and gather strength for the challenges ahead. As the Wraith 7 waited silently on the surface, the crew realized the importance of timing. The machines above would not stop until they had found all survivors or destroyed the tunnels completely. Mira said they needed to act before the machines adapted to their tactics. Rafe nodded, understanding that patience and speed had to work. Together, the survivors began to trust the crew more, following instructions without question because every movement counted. Jex tested new sensors that could detect harvester energy patterns from further away, giving them a better chance of avoiding detection. Thorn and Hale organized patrols and created simple signals to warn the group of danger. Every person had a role, and every action mattered by the end of the third day. The crew had rescued most of the nearby survivors and prepared plans for the rest. They were tired, covered in dust and ash, but their determination had not weakened. Mira used her implant to map escape routes and hidden tunnels that the harvesters had overlooked. Rafe trained in the use of portable weapons, checking every system on the ship, preparing for a sudden attack. Jex worked tirelessly to make the Wraith 7 ready for rapid takeoff if needed. Thorn and Hale remained vigilant, watching over the group and keeping everyone calm. The small girl, tired but smiling faintly, whispered that she felt safe. Mira held her and promised that as long as they were together, no one would be left behind. The crew of the Wraith 7 knew that the journey was far from over. The machines above were still learning, adapting, and watching. More survivors were hidden, more dangers awaited, and the real threat of the harvesters was still to come. Yet the small victories, the lives saved, and the bond between the crew and the people they protected gave them strength. They had answered the first calls for help and proved that even the monsters of Earth could act with courage, heart, and determination. As the cavern grew quiet for the night, each member of the crew reflected on the choices that had brought them here. They knew that the universe was vast, dangerous, and often cruel. But they also knew that they had the power to fight back, to protect, and to save. The Wraith 7 waited silently, ready for the next mission. while the stars outside held secrets, challenges, and cries for help that were far from finished. The Wraith. 7 stayed hidden on the scorched plateau while the crew planned their next move. The survivors had eaten, rested, and tried to recover from the fear and hunger that had haunted them for weeks. The small girl clung to Mira, who kept her calm with soft words and gentle touches. The cavern was quiet now, but the distant towers of the harvesters stood tall against the weak sun, silent yet menacing. Rafe and Jex studied the energy readings from the towers. It showed that the machines were still active and scanning constantly, adapting to any irregularities in their environment. Every movement above ground could trigger an attack, so the crew had to be careful. Rafe knew that the only way to save everyone was to strike carefully and quickly. They could not run forever. Mira connected her implant to portable sensors and scanned the tunnels. She found signs of more survivors, some trapped under debris, others hiding in chambers too narrow for the machines to reach. The signal from one of them was weak, but still alive. She explained to the crew that they would have to split into groups again. One group would go underground to rescue the trapped survivors. Another would create distractions on the surface to keep the machines occupied. Jex tested the ship's systems, making sure the engines could handle a quick takeoff if needed. Thorn and Hale prepared the EMP devices, positioning them near the harvester towers to cause confusion. Every step was dangerous, but the crew had become skilled at moving quietly and quickly. The survivors would follow their lead, learning from their example. The first group, led by Mira, entered the tunnels. The paths were dark, narrow, and uneven, and they moved carefully to avoid loose rocks and sudden drops. Mira guided them through twists and turns, using her implant to sense the smallest changes in energy. The weak signal led them to a collapsed section of the tunnels where a family had been trapped. The father was pinned under a heavy beam, the mother trying to shield their children from falling debris.
Alice.
Mira helped free the father, while Thorn and Hale supported the mother and children. Rafe and Jex provided cover, ready to respond if any machines approached. The family was terrified, but relief replaced fear when they realized they were being rescued. Mira held the small girl she had found the previous day and whispered that everything would be fine. The rescued family followed the crew back to the main cavern, each step taken carefully to avoid alerting the towers above. Meanwhile, on the surface, Rafe, Jex, Thorn, and Hale worked quickly. They positioned the EMP devices in patterns that would create multiple points of interference. The first devices activated, causing the nearest harvester towers to flicker and emit strange pulses of energy. The machines responded, sending out waves to detect the source. Rafe and Jex observed from a safe distance, noting each movement and planning the next step. Thorn and Hale moved to new positions, resetting and triggering additional devices. The machines became confused, some reacting to the wrong locations, while others tried to communicate with each other but failed to coordinate. The crew used this distraction to help Mira's team move the rescued survivors through safer tunnels. Each step was a race against time. The day passed slowly, filled with tension. Myra's implant continued to trace signals, leading them to more survivors, hidden deeper underground. The crew moved with precision, communicating in whispers and hand signals. Every person had a role, and everyone depended on each other. The small girl stayed close to Mira, her presence a reminder of why they were risking everything. The rescued survivors began to trust the crew, following their instructions without hesitation. They learned quickly to move quietly, to avoid traps, and to help one another. Each successful rescue gave the crew more confidence, but they knew the harvesters were still learning, still watching, that any mistake could be fatal. By late afternoon, the crew had rescued several more groups. The tunnels were crowded now, but the survivors moved in an organized way, guided by the crew's experience. Mira led them to a wider chamber where they could rest safely. Rafe and Jex returned from the surface briefly to check the EMP devices and make adjustments. Thorn and Hale stayed behind to cover the area, ensuring no machines discovered the group. The crew used the time to plan the next moves carefully. Mira traced the remaining signals, showing that the remaining survivors were trapped under more debris or hidden in narrow passages. The paths to reach them were dangerous, but there was no other choice. They could not leave anyone behind. As night fell, the crew prepared for the next mission. Rafe checked the Wraith 7 and made sure it was ready for a quick departure. Recalibrated the engines and sensors, testing them for any sudden emergencies. Mira reviewed the maps of the tunnels, marking safe paths and predicting potential dangers. Thorn and Hale prepared weapons and EMP devices for rapid deployment. The survivors rested briefly, knowing that they would have to move again soon. Small Girl slept in Mira's arms, her trust in the crew complete. The quiet in the cavern was temporary, a brief pause before the next push to rescue more people. The next morning, Mira led a team to the deepest tunnels. The paths were narrow, dark, and filled with obstacles, but the crew moved with skill and confidence. They found survivors trapped under fallen rock and broken tunnels. Each rescue required careful planning, strength, and patience. Thorn and Hale used simple tools to lift heavy debris, while Rafe and Jex provided cover and support. Mira guided everyone, her implant allowing them to avoid areas where the machines might detect them. Each survivor was helped out carefully, and the small groups moved back to the main cavern where safety had been established. On the surface, harvester towers remained active, scanning and sending out energy pulses. The crew used EMP devices strategically, creating confusion and giving the underground teams enough time to rescue survivors. The machines were dangerous, but the crew had learned their patterns and could predict their reactions. Each move was deliberate, measured, and coordinated. The combination of underground skill and surface distraction allowed the team to save more people than they had initially thought possible. By evening, crew and survivors returned to the main cavern, exhausted but alive. The small girl hugged Mira, smiling faintly despite the fear she had faced. Rafe looked at the group and felt pride in their work. They had saved dozens of people, proven that courage and teamwork could overcome fear, and shown that even in the darkest places, hope could survive. Jex checked the Wraith 7, making minor repairs and ensuring readiness for a sudden escape if needed. Thorn and Hale patrolled the cavern perimeter, their eyes alert for any signs of danger. Mira continued to monitor energy flows, making sure no machines were nearby or preparing an attack. The crew understood that the battle was far from over. The harvester towers still dominated the planet, and more survivors remained hidden in dangerous areas. The machines above would adapt to their tactics, learn from their actions, and respond with greater force. Yet each rescue strengthened the bond between the crew and the survivors, creating trust and a sense of unity. They knew that they were no longer just rescuers, they were protectors, guides, and a symbol of hope in a system filled with fear and destruction. The night was quiet. Each member of the crew knew that it was only temporary. The Wraith 7 waited on the plateau, ready for the next mission. Mira traced signals, marking paths for future rescues. Rafe and Jex prepared the ship for rapid movement and emergency takeoff. Thorn and Hale kept watch, listening to every sound and watching every shadow. The survivors rested as best they could, knowing that they were not alone. The small girl slept peacefully, a symbol of what the crew was fighting for. As they rested, Rafe reflected on how far they had come. From the moment they had heard the cry for help, they had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty. Yet they had persevered. Mira had guided them with skill and intuition. Jex had ensured the ship could take them anywhere. Thorn and Hale had provided strength, protection, and courage. Together, they had turned what the world called monsters into heroes, while the harvesters were still a threat, and while more dangers awaited. The crew had proven that no cry for help would go unanswered while they were present. The first successes had given them hope, but they knew the real challenges were still ahead. More survivors remained trapped, and the machines above would not remain passive forever. The Wraith 7 stood ready. The crew rested for a brief moment, and the survivors gained their first taste of safety in weeks. The work was far from finished, but the crew had learned that courage, unity, and determination could overcome even the greatest dangers. And as they prepared to move again, each member of the crew knew that they would face whatever came next together. answering the cries for help that echoed across the system and proving that even the monsters of Earth could shine in the darkest places. The Wraith 7 waited quietly on the plateau while the crew prepared for the most dangerous part of their mission. The survivors huddled in the cavern, tired and frightened, but they trusted the crew now. Rafe stood near the edge of the plateau, looking at the distant towers of the harvesters. The machines above were still active, scanning, moving, and learning. Every pulse of energy was a reminder of how dangerous the system could be. Rafe knew that the next steps would be critical. They had rescued many already, but the final group of survivors was trapped in a deep network of tunnels beneath the largest city. Reaching them meant confronting the harvesters more directly than ever. Mira connected her implant to portable devices, tracing the signals with care. The weak pulses from the final survivors were buried under layers of energy interference from the towers. She studied the patterns and found small windows when the machines would pause briefly before sending out new scans. These brief moments would be their chance to move. She explained the plan to the crew. They would split into two groups. One group would go underground to reach the trapped survivors, while the other would create distractions on the surface to draw the machine's attention. Timing and precision were critical. Jex adjusted the ship's engines and systems to provide support if an emergency escape was necessary. Thorn and Hale readied the EMP devices, checking every connection and battery to ensure they would work at the right moment. The underground team, led by Mira, entered the narrow tunnels. The paths were dark, twisted, and unstable. Every step had to be calculated to avoid falling debris or triggering harvester sensors. The weak signals led them to a large chamber where dozens of people had been trapped for weeks. Some were injured, some were weak from hunger, and others were terrified of leaving the safety of hiding. Mira guided the group carefully, helping them move and calming their fears. Thorn and Hale assisted by clearing obstacles and using makeshift tools to free those pinned under rubble. Rafe and Jex stayed on the surface, monitoring energy readings and ready to trigger the EMP devices at the precise moment. The tension was high because one false move could alert the harvesters and endanger everyone. On the surface, Bref and Jex moved quickly. They positioned the EMP devices near the towers, creating multiple points of interference. The first devices activated, causing the nearest harvester towers to flicker and emit strange pulses of energy. The machines responded, sending out signals to detect the source. Some towers moved toward the disturbance while others tried to communicate with each other, creating confusion. Rafe and Jex watched carefully, ready to adjust the timing or trigger additional devices as needed. The plan was working. The machines were distracted. Giving the underground team a critical window to move the survivors safely, Myra led the survivors through narrow passages, avoiding any areas that might alert the machines. She whispered instructions, keeping voices low and movements controlled. Thorn and Hale stayed behind, making sure no one was left behind and clearing obstacles as they moved. The small girl clung to Mira, walking steadily beside her. Each step brought them closer to safety, but the tunnels grew more unstable the deeper they went. Rocks shifted, dust fell, and the sound of distant machines echoed through the passages. The crew remained calm, knowing that panic would endanger everyone. Slowly but surely, they guided the survivors through the labyrinthine tunnels, keeping them safe and moving steadily toward the exit. Back on the surface, the machines reacted to the EMP devices. Some towers tried to locate the source, sending out energy waves that swept across the plateau. Rafe and Jex adjusted the devices, keeping the towers distracted just long enough for the underground team to continue. Thorn and Hale moved carefully, repositioning devices and preparing for a final surge to ensure complete confusion. The plan required perfect coordination, and the crew worked together with precise timing. Every movement, every action, and every signal had to be correct. Mistakes could be deadly. The underground team finally reached the chamber where the final survivors were trapped. They were weak, injured, and afraid. Myra and Thorn worked quickly to free those pinned under debris, while Hale guided the others to safety. The small girl stayed close to Mira, offering silent support and holding the hands of the frightened children. Slowly, the team moved the survivors through narrow passages toward the surface. Every step was tense. Every sound could mean detection, but the crew remained focused.
Yes.
They had come this far, and they would not fail now. As they emerged from the tunnels, the surface team provided cover. Rafe and Jex monitored the towers, ready to trigger the final EMP devices if needed. Thorn and Hale helped the survivors move quickly to the Wraith 7, keeping them low and out of sight. The machines above responded, sending pulses of energy and moving to investigate. But the crew used the devices strategically to maintain the confusion. The survivors moved steadily, guided by the crew, and finally reached the safety of the plateau. Near the ship, the crew paused to catch their breath and regroup. All the survivors were accounted for, and the immediate danger had been avoided. Mira checked the energy readings and confirmed that the machines had not detected the majority of the group. Rafe looked at the Wraith 7 and knew that the ship would be their lifeline if the harvesters continued to respond. Jex ran final checks on the engines, ensuring that the ship could take off quickly if needed. Thorn and Hale kept watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of the machines adjusting their patterns. The survivors, though tired and shaken, were safe for now. They had been guided, protected, and led through a dangerous system by the crew. The small girl held Mira's hand tightly, smiling faintly. She whispered softly, asking if they would really be safe now. Myra nodded, promising that as long as they stayed together, no one would be left behind. The survivors gathered around, some hugging each other, others sitting quietly and trying to rest. The crew knew this moment was temporary. The harvesters were still active, and the system was not yet secure. However, the immediate mission had succeeded. They had reached the trapped survivors, guided them safely through dangerous tunnels, and provided hope where there had been despair. Rafe gathered the crew to discuss the next steps. Mira traced energy readings and identified remaining threats. Jex prepared the ship for a possible emergency takeoff. Thorn and Hale reinforced barricades and monitored the area for any unexpected movement. Every member of the crew understood the gravity of the situation. The harvesters were intelligent, adaptable, and relentless. Any sign of weakness could be exploited. Yet, despite the danger, the crew had demonstrated courage, skill, and teamwork. They had faced fear and danger head-on and had come through alive. As night fell, the Wraith 7 waited quietly on the plateau. The survivors rested inside the cavern, feeling safer than they had in weeks. The small girl slept in Mira's arms, her trust in the crew complete. Rafe looked out at the distant towers of the harvesters, knowing that the battle was not over. The machines above would continue to adapt, learn, and respond. More dangers were likely ahead, and the crew would need to remain vigilant. Yet, the successful rescue had strengthened their resolve. They had shown that even in the darkest places, hope could survive. The crew discussed their next moves carefully. Myra would continue tracing signals to ensure no survivors were left behind. Rafe and Jex would maintain the Wraith 7, keeping it ready for rapid movement or emergency escape. Thorn and Hale would continue patrolling and reinforcing safety measures for the survivors. Every step was planned with care, every action considered, and every decision made with the knowledge that lives depended on them. The bond between the crew and the survivors had grown strong, creating trust and unity that would carry them through the next challenges. The Wraith 7 waited silently, engines humming softly. The crew rested briefly, knowing that time was limited and danger was always near. The survivors slept, feeling safe for the first time in weeks. The small girl dreamed quietly, her presence a reminder of why the crew risked everything. Mira kept one eye on the readings, ensuring that no immediate threats were approaching. Rafe watched the horizon, prepared for any sudden movement. Checked the ship's systems, ready to react at a moment's notice. Thorn and Hale maintained vigilance, ensuring the safety of everyone in the cavern. The crew had faced the harvesters, rescued the survivors, and created hope where there had been fear, yet they knew the battle was far from over. The machines above would continue to adapt, and the system would remain dangerous. The crew understood that their mission was ongoing, that the work of protecting and guiding the survivors was not complete. They had proven that courage, skill, and teamwork could overcome fear and danger. They had shown that even the monsters of Earth could become heroes. As the night settled over the scorched planet, the crew of the Wraith 7 reflected on their journey so far. They had answered cries for help, faced unknown dangers, and saved lives against impossible odds. The survivors trusted them, and the crew had formed a bond that could not be broken. The harvesters remained a threat, but the crew knew that they would continue to fight, to protect, and to save. The Wraith 7 waited silently, ready for the next mission, and the crew remained vigilant, prepared to face whatever came next. The first real victories had been achieved, but the larger battle was ahead. More challenges, more danger, and more opportunities to prove courage awaited. The crew knew that their strength lay in their unity, their skill, and their determination to protect the innocent. The survivors had hope now, and the crew would ensure that hope was not lost. They were ready to face the harvesters again, to fight for life, and to continue answering cries for help wherever they appeared. The Wraith 7 stood ready, the crew vigilant, and the survivors safe for now, as the stars above held secrets and dangers yet to be revealed. The Wraith 7 rested quietly on the plateau as the crew, and the survivors recovered from their long mission. The night was calm, but the distant towers of the harvesters still stood like dark sentinels, silently, scanning the planet for any signs of movement. Rafe watched the horizon, knowing that the machines would not stop. They were intelligent, adaptable, and relentless. Every decision made by the crew had to be precise, or the consequences could be fatal. Mira sat nearby, her small implant devices glowing softly as she traced faint energy signals, ensuring that no hidden threats remained near the survivors. The small girl slept peacefully in Mira's arms, trusting completely in the people who had saved her. Jex checked the Wraith 7 one last time, confirming that the engines, shields, and sensors were ready for any emergency. Thorn and Hale patrolled the cavern, alert to every sound, shadow, and vibration in the rocky terrain. The survivors, exhausted but alive, finally allowed themselves to rest, feeling safer than they had in weeks. The crew knew that their work was not finished. The system was still dangerous. The harvesters above could detect any sign of life if they concentrated long enough. Rafe called the team together to discuss the final step of their mission. Mira traced the remaining energy signatures and found that the last cluster of harvester machines was concentrated around a deep city ruin near the largest tower. The trapped survivors from earlier were safe now. But the voice that had first reached Earth, the one that had started all of this, belonged to a group still held in the ruins below. The crew realized that reaching them would require their full strength, precise timing, and courage beyond what they had shown so far. Every member of the team understood the risk, but no one hesitated. They had answered a cry for help once. They would do it again. Jex checked the Wraith 7's engines and weapons, preparing for rapid support. He suggested that if the team was discovered or overwhelmed, the ship could provide cover fire, or quick extraction. Rafe nodded, noting that the ship would be their lifeline in an emergency. Mira continued scanning the energy fields, identifying weak points in the harvester network. Thorn and Hale prepared EMP devices and defensive gear, positioning them to create distractions and mislead the machines while the rescue operation went forward. The survivors would stay in the cavern, guided and protected by the crew, until the mission was complete. Every detail had to be precise. The underground team moved first. Mira led them through narrow passages, guiding them toward the ruins of the city. The tunnels were dark, jagged, and unstable. Dust fell from the ceilings, and loose rocks threatened to give way underfoot. Every step required careful attention, and every sound could alert the harvesters above. Mira whispered instructions, her voice calm but urgent. Thorn and Hale followed, clearing obstacles and carrying tools to lift debris. Rafe stayed on the surface, watching energy readings from the towers. Jex monitored the ship and prepared to trigger the first EMP devices at the perfect moment. Timing, coordination, and silence were critical. The faint pulse of the original voice guided the team, growing stronger as they approached the trapped survivors. The group reached a large chamber deep beneath the ruins, where dozens of people were trapped. They were weak, hungry, and frightened. But relief flooded their faces when they saw the crew. Mira helped calm them, explaining that they were safe and that the crew would lead them out. Thorn and Hale worked quickly, removing fallen debris and stabilizing the walls to create a safe path. Rafe and Jex observed the surface and the energy signals, noting movements of the towers and preparing the EMP devices. Every second counted, as the harvesters were still searching, sending out scanning pulses that could detect even the smallest signs of life. On the surface, Rafe triggered the first EMP devices. Lights flickered on the towers and energy pulses shot out, causing confusion in the harvester network. The machines reacted, some moving toward the disturbance, while others tried to communicate with each other. Jex adjusted the devices, keeping the towers distracted long enough for the underground team to move the survivors. Thorn and Hale monitored the area, ready to deploy additional EMPs or create new distractions if necessary. The strategy worked. The machines became disoriented, giving Mira's team the window they needed to move quickly through the tunnels. The crew guided the trapped survivors through narrow passages, over debris, and past hazards with precision. Closely beside Mira, holding the hands of frightened children and offering quiet encouragement. The survivors learned to move silently, follow instructions, and trust the crew completely. Every step brought them closer to safety, but the tunnels grew more unstable, and the pressure from the machines above increased. Myra remained calm, using her implant to sense energy patterns and anticipate movements from the towers. Thorn and Hale continued clearing obstacles and protecting the group, while Rafe and Jex managed the surface distractions and monitored the Wraith. 7 for emergencies. Hours passed as the group navigated the final sections of the tunnels. The voice that had called Earth for help guided them, growing louder and clearer as they approached the surface. Mira checked each survivor, ensuring that no one was left behind. Thorn and Hale carried those too weak to walk, moving swiftly but carefully. Rafe adjusted the EMP devices on the surface, keeping the tower's attention focused away from the tunnel exits. Jex monitored energy signals from the Wraith 7, ready to provide cover fire or lift the group to safety if the harvesters discovered them. The tension was high, but the crew worked as a single unit, coordinating movements and decisions with precision. Finally, the group emerged from the tunnels near the plateau where the Wraith 7 waited. The survivors were exhausted, covered in dust and dirt but alive. Mira held the small girl tightly, whispering that they were safe now. Rafe and Jex triggered the final EMP devices, creating one last wave of confusion among the harvester towers. Thorn and Hale led the survivors to the ship, making sure no one lagged behind. The crew counted every person, confirming that all survivors had been rescued. Relief swept through the group, but they remained cautious. Knowing that the machines above were still active, the Wraith 7 lifted off carefully, avoiding detection as much as possible. The survivors looked out the windows at the scorched planet below, finally able to see the destruction from a safe distance. The towers of the harvesters loomed, but the ship's speed and shields kept them out of harm's way. Mira continued monitoring energy signals, noting that the machines were searching but unable to track the ship precisely. Rafe piloted with steady hands, guiding them through the system, while Jex made minor adjustments to maintain speed and stability. Thorn and Hale stayed near the survivors, ensuring that everyone remained calm and safe. As they moved away from the planet, the crew finally allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. The immediate mission was complete. The cry for help that had reached Earth weeks earlier had been answered. Survivors were safe, and the harvesters had been temporarily distracted and delayed. The crew looked at each other exhausted but proud of what they had accomplished. Mira smiled faintly at the small girl, who now seemed more relaxed and less afraid. Thorn and Hale exchanged a nod of satisfaction. Rafe and Jex focused on keeping the Wraith 7 steady, but their expressions carried the weight of relief. The survivors began to recover slowly, eating and resting while the ship traveled through space. Some spoke softly about the horrors they had faced. Others remained silent, processing the events in their own way. The small girl clung to Myra, no longer trembling with fear, and slowly began to speak, asking quiet questions about the crew, the ship, and the stars. Myra answered as best she could, keeping her tone calm and simple. The crew realized that they had not only saved lives, but had given hope to people who had lost everything. Rafe stood near the cockpit, watching the stars stretch endlessly ahead. He reflected on how far they had come and how much they had risked. The Wraith 7 had carried them into the heart of danger, and together, they had faced fears that most humans would never understand. Myra monitored the energy readings, confirming that the harvesters had not followed. Jex ran final checks on the engines and shields, ensuring that the ship could continue safely. Thorn and Hale prepared for any sudden emergency, keeping weapons and tools close, ready to act if needed, as they moved farther from the planet. The survivors began to speak more openly, expressing gratitude, relief, and even hope for the future. They looked at the crew with new understanding, realizing that the people Earth had called monsters had become their heroes. The bond between the crew and the survivors was strong, formed through shared danger, courage, and trust. The small girl smiled faintly, her fear replaced with wonder at the stars outside. Mira held her hand and whispered that they would be safe now. The crew would continue to protect those in need wherever they could. Rafe gathered the crew for a final discussion. Mira confirmed that the immediate danger from the harvesters had passed. Jex ensured the Wraith 7 was ready for travel. Supplies were sufficient, and the engines were stable. Thorn and Hale checked on the survivors, making sure everyone was comfortable and accounted for. The crew understood that the universe was vast and dangerous, but they had proven that courage, teamwork, and determination could overcome even the greatest challenges. They had answered a cry for help, faced monsters beyond human understanding, and saved lives that would have been lost without their intervention. The Wraith 7